Today on Face the Nation, a triple disaster of unimagined proportions in Japan. First an earthquake, then the tsunami, and the damage from what now looks like has set off a meltdown in one of the country's nuclear reactors. Our correspondents are spread across Japan, and we'll have the latest from overnight. It's all ahead on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schiffer. And now from Washington, Bob Schiffer.
And good morning again, though the news this morning is not very good, not good at all. But here is the latest. The Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan said today the disaster that had hit his country, and we're quoting him directly here, is the worst crisis for Japan since World War II. The death toll is now likely to go beyond 10,000 in just one state alone. It turns out the quake damaged 2 nuclear reactors at a power plant on the coast, maybe 3. One of them seems to be going through a partial meltdown, which means radiation could leak. We have a team of CBS News correspondents in Japan this morning. CBS News correspondent Celia Hatton is in Fukushima, the site of that nuclear power plant. Celia, what is the latest there?
Well, Bob, it's been another day of grim news coming from the Fukushima nuclear plant. Now, just a few hours ago, authorities warned that the situation to prevent total meltdown at 3 faulty nuclear reactors is an ongoing challenge. They warned that if something happens to one reactor, it could affect the others nearby. So generator number 3 is now the most at risk for an outer container explosion like the one that took place a day ago on generator number 1. That's when officials did the only thing they could to prevent the entire reactor from blasting open. They released a bit of radioactive steam to reduce pressure in that generator number 1, which led to a larger than expected explosion. So that's what we look for that could be coming from generator number 3 in the next day or so. It seems likely that officials are going to have to do a similar operation on generator number 3. So unfortunately, we're expecting more explosions from that nuclear plant.
Now, how many people have been evacuated from there thus far?
At the moment, the average number is 170, although estimates do vary. I've seen as high as 200,000 people evacuated from that 12-mile radius, and even a little bit beyond that, because frankly, nobody wants to be that close to these nuclear plants at the moment. So there are large numbers of people who are on the move in the area trying to escape.
And what about radiation sickness? Any signs of that? I know they have started issuing iodine for people just in case. What's that situation?
They're handing out iodine tablets to people who are within a certain area around the nuclear plant. Not everybody is getting the iodine pills, but they are trying to scan everybody for any effects of radiation. So far, again, there are varying numbers as to how many people are affected by radiation. But actually, at this point, Bob, it's very difficult to know whether their health has been affected in the long term. We simply don't know enough about the situation at the moment.
How are the people taking it there, Celia?
You know, it's been really interesting watching the reactions over the past 2 days. Definitely anxiety and concern is mounting on this day 2 that I've been able to watch the people here. You know, it's fascinating. The televisions are on in every room at all, any place that has electricity. People are just gathered around watching these televisions 24 hours a day, trying to find any news they can about the nuclear reactor. And of course here, that means the difference as to whether they can go back to their family home or not. It really is quite serious. But at the same time, when there's a strong aftershock, nobody here seems to blink except for me, because I'm not as used to earthquakes here as the people who've grown up here their whole lives. So it really is. It's been a very sad and frustrating situation for many of the people here.
Well, Celia, thank you so much. Obviously, you're going to stay on the job there. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.
Now, Harry Smith, our man on the move who was just back from the Middle East, is in Tokyo this morning, which for all the troubles is returning to relative normalcy. Harry, what's the latest there?
Stunning difference, Bob, between Friday and today. Narita Airport, the big airport, wide open, business as usual. The only difference that I would say we saw there were numerous crews, rescue crews, that had clearly been flown in there and were about to be deployed up north. As far as downtown Tokyo is concerned, we didn't see a single vestige of earthquake damage. People were strolling through the park. It was a Sunday afternoon as if nothing had happened.
But that is very much in contrast to what's going on in the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's for sure, Bob, because everything up north is basically on kind of a lockdown. I'm not sure if you've heard this or not, but there are more than 100,000 troops that are going to be deployed here in Japan through this disaster. As the Japanese Prime Minister said, this is the worst disaster to hit Japan since World War II. And even people here, as far away from the earthquake epicenter as Tokyo was, they said this was the worst they had ever felt. They felt like they were literally rocking back and forth in the buildings, and it also speaks to how earthquake-proof Tokyo is, because as we say, as we came through town, we didn't see a single vestige of damage anyplace.
But as you go around the country, I mean, the statistics that we're hearing from the government are just almost unbelievable. 215,000 people living in 1,300 temporary shelters. 1.5 million households have not had water since the quake. You mentioned the 60,000 or the 100,000 troops that have been deployed. It's hard to imagine something like this happening to this country.
You know, and it's interesting because there's no place on the planet that is better prepared for this than Japan is. Earthquake is almost a part of people's daily mantra, as it were. It's something they keep in mind all the time. There are all constant civil defense drills. There are constant drills for sirens and evacuations. So this is maybe the place on the planet that's best prepared for something like this, and then you see the kind of devastation and damage that has happened as a result, and you wondered if it had happened someplace else. It's hard to imagine, but it would have been much, much, much worse.
Harry Smith, the coastal city of Sendai is closest to the epicenter, and our CBS News correspondent Bill Whitaker is there.
Hello, Bob. I'm in the offices of TBC Television here in Sendai City, one of the few places in the city to have power. This television station is now running off of generator power. It took us 15 hours to get here from Tokyo, and this is a ride that usually takes about 4 to 5 hours. But most of the roads coming into Sendai have either been damaged or closed down by authorities. This is one of the hardest hit cities in all of Japan. Tonight, outside, the night air is filled with a wail of sirens, of fire engines racing down to a massive fire by the port, a fire so big that it's turned the whole eastern sky into a bright orange red. When we got here earlier this afternoon, we saw people running to high ground. They had just had another aftershock and another warning of another tsunami. People here are very frightened and very skittish, and they have good reason to be. Not only did they endure one of the worst earthquakes ever recorded here in Japan, but people say it was 30 minutes after that the huge tsunami swept through. And from what we could see, the tsunami swept in several miles inland. It's kind of hard to explain the power of that surging water, but we saw tanker trucks and 18-wheelers and cars and even planes flipped upside down, thrown around as if they were pieces of paper. And tonight here, the city is without power, without telephone, without water. It seems it'll be some time before Sendai can get back on its feet. Bob?
Bill Whitaker. Thank you, Bill. CBS News correspondent Lucy Kraft has been covering this thing since it first hit. Lucy, how are the Japanese people taking all of this?
Well, the question on everybody's lips is, we're the most technologically advanced country in the world, one of them. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We know about disaster prevention. We have a state-of-the-art system. How on earth did this happen? And a lot of criticism is being leveled at the government for coming at this flat-footed. But it has to be said that the one phrase that's on the lips of all the government spokespeople and a lot of the university professors who study disasters is "sote guy," a phrase that means this was beyond our expectations, this was not in the textbooks. We had a nuclear power plant that had backup system upon backup system upon backup system, and yet it was helpless against these huge tsunami. Some interesting facts, for example, the Kobe earthquake, which was a magnitude 7, this lasted for, the tremors lasted for a matter of a few seconds. This earthquake that we just had the other day lasted for 5 minutes. Again, beyond the experience of anyone in Japan. A tsunami, the textbooks say that a tsunami comes an hour after a major earthquake. In this case, people had 9 minutes warning before the first giant tsunami started striking the shore. So this was well beyond anybody's planning design. Another question is, you know, the rescue teams have been unable to get to all of the victims because they're spread over such a wide area. And Japan right now is terribly depopulated. We have people living in very remote areas, particularly elderly people living in homes that you know, just fall apart at the first sign of an earthquake. Maybe we need to have people living more closely together out of areas that are at higher risk. So there's a lot of soul searching that's going to be happening, and as the Prime Minister said, it's the worst crisis for Japan since World War II. Right now, I think the country is just in a state of shock. There's a lot of questions now. One of the newspapers, the Yomiuri, this morning was saying that the stock market may crash on Monday when it opens. Certainly the companies that are the pillar of the Japanese economy, as you know, is trade dependent, and the companies that are the gold standard for the country, Toyota, despite all its travails, is extremely well run, very profitable company. Sony, Honda, Nissan, all of these companies that really are the backbone of the Japanese economy are at a standstill right now because their factories have been damaged or because their supply chains are stopped. So the country really is on hold right now, and it's going to require a vast amount of rethinking about how do we deal with the crisis.
Lucy Kraft, and we want to say thanks to Lucy, to Bill Whitaker, to Harry Smith, to Celia Hatton, all of our correspondents, and there are more on the way covering this story in Japan. We want to go now to Atlanta. The chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, Joe Lieberman, is there. Senator, obviously our hearts go out to the people in Japan, but I guess we better turn to the local news here. Does this pose any kind of a danger for the United States? I mean, if this radiation gets into the atmosphere, is it a danger of it drifting here?
There is some risk, but I'd say right now, from what I know, Bob, that it's remote. But what this horrific natural disaster in Japan has to do for all of us is to go back and look at our preparedness for such a catastrophe here. This was an enormous earthquake. Just to put it in context, the Japanese earthquake hit 9.0 on the Richter scale. The great San Francisco earthquake of 1906 was only 7.6. So you can see how hard it is to plan for something like that. I do want to assure Americans who are watching that after Hurricane Katrina and all the failures that we saw with FEMA, our committee investigated, we recommended, we passed a reform bill. FEMA now has 10 regional offices that drill with state and local officials for preparedness for any kind of natural disaster, particularly the ones that are more likely in given areas. We have 104 nuclear power plants in our country. Every year, once a year, FEMA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the power plants go through emergency drilling, evacuation planning to see what they would do if a disaster struck. But the reality is that we're watching something unfold, and we don't know where it's going with regard to the nuclear power plants in Japan right now. And I think it calls on us here in the U.S. naturally not to stop building nuclear power plants, but to put the brakes on right now until we understand the ramifications of what's happened in Japan. Final word of reassurance to the American people. Since 3 Mile Island, we upgraded safety standards for our nuclear power plants, and right now no plant can be built unless it can withstand the known highest earthquake in that geographic area, plus some margin of safety. This is part of what we do.
What you're saying here is that we should have a moratorium now on building nuclear plants. We should just kind of stop and kind of reassess.
Yeah, I've been a big supporter of nuclear power because it's domestic, it's ours, and it's clean. We've had a good safety record with nuclear power plants here in the United States. But I think we've got to. I don't want to stop the building of nuclear power plants. But I think we've got to kind of quickly put the brakes on until we can absorb what has happened in Japan as a result of the earthquake and the tsunami, and then see what more, if anything, we can demand of the new power plants that are coming online. We've got 104 nuclear power plants in America now. I was informed this morning that about 23 of them are built according to designs that are similar to the nuclear power plants in Japan that are now the focus of our concern.
And what about, are we prepared for an earthquake like this? I mean, obviously this is not something that's going to happen once a week, but what about our buildings in this country? Is it time to think about reassessing specifications for that?
It is. The Japanese, as we've learned in the last few days, because of the terrible earthquake around Kobe, back about 15 years ago, have retrofitted old buildings. New buildings have high standards for withstanding earthquakes. In the West Coast, California, of course, we always think of the area of our country most likely to be hit by earthquakes. New buildings have been equipped with earthquake-resistant systems. A lot of the old buildings have not been retrofitted. It's time, I think, for states to look at their building codes and to see whether they want to take preventive action. The other thing, I spoke this morning with Craig Fugate, the administrator of FEMA, and one of the things he said that he worries about is that the individual American people are not ready for what to do. The government is ready, about as ready as we can be, but what to do in the case of a disaster. And go to the FEMA website, because if you live particularly near the coast, you got to have an evacuation plan. You've got to have emergency supplies so you'll be safe to respond to a disaster.
Right. Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. When we come back in a minute, we're going to talk to David Sanger of the New York Times and our own David Martin, our national security correspondent, in just a minute. Back now with David Sanger, Chief Washington Correspondent of the New York Times. 6 years the Bureau Chief for the Times in Tokyo, and our own David Martin, of course, our National Security Correspondent. David, what should we be looking for now in the next couple of days?
Well, in addition to the rescue operation, which I'm afraid has been sort of bad news getting to worse, I think that the nuclear plants are going to be the real focus of attention. And here the question is, how much meltdown has happened? Sunday morning Japan time, the government said that they had to assume that 2 of the plants were in partial meltdown. There's already been some detected amounts of cesium in the air. This is a very radioactive material that kind of gets into everything, and of course it became the big problem in Chernobyl. Nobody's expecting a Chernobyl-size issue here, but if the levels of cesium in the atmosphere continue to go up, then the problem of evacuating people is going to be much higher, and the problem of cleaning up is going to be much harder.
We're already involved, the U.S. military, in a very big way there, David. Just give me a little rundown on what we're doing there and what's the Pentagon worried about here?
Well, U.S. military helicopters based in Japan have already evacuated 600 people from the disaster zone. The aircraft carrier Reagan is on station, serving as what the military calls a lily pad for Japanese helicopters to refuel at and operate off of as they go about disaster relief. There are about 6 other ships there that are searching the sea for anybody still alive who was washed out to sea by the tsunami. And there are several other big deck ships on the way, some of them, at least one of them anyway, carrying Japanese troops, because internal movement is a big problem here. And so the more the U.S. Navy can move these troops, the better off Japan is.
What is the main worry of our military about this?
Well, I think the U.S. military has the same worry about those plants that everybody else does, and they have no special capability to deal with it.
David, I want to ask you, the Japanese government, do you feel that they've come clean, or are they giving us the facts on this? Sometimes governments tend to try to coat things like this with good news. What is the kind of the record of the Japanese government?
Well, the record in the nuclear arena is not great. There have been some much smaller nuclear incidents over the years, and either the electric power companies or the government regulatory agency have been involved and gotten caught later on sort of downplaying the worst of the news. In one case, editing a tape out to make it appear that an accident was not as bad as it was. Here, you don't know how much of this is just the fog of confusion and crisis management, and how much of it is trying to just make sure that people don't panic. And there's always, in a situation like this, the sort of fine line between not wanting to worsen an already panicked situation and coming clean with everybody about what's going on.
Well, in line with that, Lucy Kraft just said that some of the papers there are saying that the stock market may crash tomorrow.
Well, it's possible it could. It's hard to know. You have to think, though, that over the long term, this could actually turn into an economic stimulus for Japan, because they're going to have to rebuild this beautiful and a quite historic area all north of Tokyo, and that could bring a lot of investment back into Japan. You already saw the yen go back up on Friday, just because of the thought that money would be flowing back into Japan. So it's very hard to sort of separate the short term from the long term here.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for adding a little perspective. I'll be back in a moment with some final thoughts on David Broder.
This portion of Face the Nation is sponsored by Bank of America, helping set opportunity in motion in communities across the country.
Finally today, when they buried David Broder of the Washington Post last week, they buried the greatest political reporter of our time, maybe any time. Until he died, David was one of the few reporters still working who was here when I came to Washington in 1969, and I shall never forget the first time I saw him. Here just a couple of weeks, I was sent to a news conference which turned into a shouting match, not with the news source, but among the reporters trying to shout down each other to ask a gotcha question. I happened to notice one reporter who had not joined in. He was just listening and writing down what the hapless official was trying to say. It was Broder, who I would later learn never talked when it interfered with listening. When I read his story the next day, I realized he had more information and a more complete account than any of us who had been trying to shout down each other. He'd apparently pieced together the story with his own reporting before he got to the news conference, and was just listening to see if the official deviated from what he already knew. And that was Broder. He did his homework before he went on a story, always did his own reporting, and more important, took the time to listen to what people said. In today's technology-driven journalism, that method is sometimes lost, but it is still the best way. They buried David Broder, but let's hope we never bury or forget his great lesson. Talk less, listen more. We will really miss you, David. That's it for us. Thanks for watching Face the Nation.